The U.S. labor market is highly dynamic, with millions of separations between firms and workers each month. Those who are paid near the minimum wage are particularly vulnerable to displacement, yet many economists argue that the long-run consequences of losing a low-wage job are likely to be minimal. With wages low to begin with, there is less scope for the kinds of firm or industry-specific skill and tenure effects that can generate earnings losses when higher-wage workers are forced to switch jobs, and, in their absence, it is presumed that low-wage workers who are displaced can easily obtain a comparable new position. This paper assesses the accuracy of that argument. How replaceable is a low-wage job? The authors combined administrative earnings records with household surveys to answer this question. Their sample includes over 230,000 workers at nearly 100,000 firms who earned $15 or less between 2001 and 2014. These individuals mostly hold common and relatively low-skilled jobs, such as working as cooks, janitors, secretaries, and retail sales workers, and the authors track their earnings and labor market outcomes for 3 years prior and 6 years after losing a job. Now, to estimate the causal effects of job loss, a simple comparison between workers who leave their jobs and those who stay is insufficient. Job separations occur for many reasons, some of which are likely to be correlated with workers' future outcomes. To address this, the authors exploit firm-specific labor demand shocks. They compare workers in firms that experience large employment reductions to workers in similar firms that don't, and all comparisons are made between workers working in the same industry and state at the same calendar time. The idea is that workers at distressed firms have a higher probability of involuntary job separations, but for reasons that reflect firm-wide pressures rather than individual-specific factors. This figure shows that these negative firm-level shocks do in fact increase the probability that low-wage workers separate from their jobs. Prior to the shock, there is no difference in separation rates for workers at affected versus unaffected firms, but afterward, separations immediately rise for those in affected firms, and there is a sharp decline in their probability of remaining employed at their initial firm. The question, then, is what happens next? The traditional perspective would argue that the long-run impact on workers' earnings should be minimal. What we actually see, however, is that these shock-induced separations lead to substantial cumulative and long-run earnings losses. Workers' employment and earnings decline in concert with the initial shock, and even 6 years later they have not fully recovered. Quarterly earnings at this point are still 13% lower, and, summing over the entire post-shock period, workers lose on average a total of 1.9 quarters of labor market experience and over $40,000 in earnings. Reductions in employment account for less than half of these effects, which implies that even workers who find new jobs are hit by significant earnings reductions. To quantify their findings, the authors match them to a labor market model and estimate that the implied value of a full-time, low-wage job is at least 3 times monthly earnings. Put another way, displacement costs are such that an unemployed worker should be willing to pay at least this amount to trade places with a worker holding a full-time, $15 per hour job. This contradicts the idea that low-wage jobs in general are easily replaceable. Is it nonetheless true that some types of low-wage work are easier to replace than others? The effects of low-wage job loss are fairly similar across sex, race, and age, and while differences in tenure drive large differences in the effects of job loss on higher-wage workers, there are no similar patterns here. Instead, where differences do arise is when looking across industries. This figure shows the effect of losing a low-wage job in the 5 most common industries in the paper's data. Workers displaced from jobs in accommodation and food services, retail, and healthcare experience relatively small short-run losses and effectively zero long-run reductions. The most common low-wage occupations in these groups are cooks and servers, salespeople and cashiers, and nursing and medical assistants. All told, their cumulative earnings reductions are around $15,000, which is less than half of the overall estimated effect. In contrast, workers in manufacturing, educational services, and all other industries experience severe effects. Their short-run earnings losses are large, recovery is sluggish, and there are meaningful long-run reductions. These workers are predominantly assemblers and fabricators, and janitors and administrative assistants, while this group includes industries such as construction and natural resource extraction. And so, this comparison reveals that in some sectors, the traditional perspective is approximately correct. Low-wage job loss does appear to have minimal long-run consequences. But in other sectors, job loss entails substantial long-run costs. To probe what drives these differences, this figure shows how various industry characteristics are related to the effects of job loss. Earnings losses tend to be larger in industries with higher unionization rates, more full-time workers, longer average tenure, and higher average pay premia. This suggests that there is meaningful variation in the quality of ostensibly similar low-wage jobs. While some may be easy to replace, good jobs in better industries are not. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes research on the returns to tenure and experience for low-skill workers, labor supply and hours constraints, and the consequences of job loss.